Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the world of the Old Testament in our continuing survey of the Old Testament. Welcome to the Middle East, the land where most of the Old Testament takes place. We have several river systems over on the to the west. We have the Nile River, and then to the east we have another river system, but it's actually two rivers: the Euphrates and the Tigris River. And these are going to be the places, the Tigris and Euphrates and the Nile River, where the earliest civilizations emerge that are mentioned in the Bible. Someone noticed back in the 1800s that this area has a period, an area of relative fertility, and so it got the title, the Fertile Crescent. Now, I'm not saying it's completely fertile, but if you look along the Nile River, it's green and it's lush, and you can plant things there. The same thing true along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. There's a few other smaller river systems that we're not pointing out here, but they help to shape that semi-crescent shape. And these two areas are going to be the area where early civilization develops along these major river systems. When we look at the Tigris and Euphrates, that has given rise to the name of that land. It's called Mesopotamia. That's just a Greek word meaning land between the rivers. And that's speaking of between the Euphrates and the Tigris. And then notice Egypt, that's the place of the Nile. Of course, modern day Egypt has these nice straight latitude and longitudinal lines. Forget about that for the ancient world. In ancient world, Egypt was the land by the Nile River. If you got away from the Nile River, you had just left Egypt. Likewise, Mesopotamia is the land between the rivers, but it might extend a bit out from there. Now, we also have the land of Hatti. That's not going to be mentioned much in the Bible. We refer to them as the Hittites, but they call them the Hatti. And as we look between Mesopotamia and Egypt, we notice that there's a little bit of what we could describe as a land bridge. You know how a bridge goes over the water? This doesn't go over water, but it separates this narrow, relatively narrow area, separates the Mediterranean from the desert to the south of Mesopotamia. And so if you're traveling from Mesopotamia to Egypt, you didn't go in a straight line. What you did is you took this land bridge because that's where the water is. That's where the fertile areas are, the areas of fertility. And this is where you can live and not die out in the desert. Same thing if you're going from the land of the Hittites, from Hatti to Egypt, you're going to go cross this land bridge. So that area alongside where that land bridge is located is going to be very strategic in the ancient world, and I think it's maybe even a little strategic even in our modern world today too. Now, this is going to be where Israel will be. It will eventually be planted where that land bridge is, but there's going to be other people before that. So initially, we're not going to call that Israel. It will eventually get that name, but it won't be called that immediately. Egypt, of course, is the land of the pyramids. Notice that we have the Great Sphinx. These are two landmarks that we see in Egypt. If we go to Hatti, we have the land of the Hittites. As I said, we're not going to see too much of them. They'll be mentioned in a few places in the Bible. If we go to the Tigris River, that's the place where the kingdom of Assyria rises, and it will eventually be a big empire where Assyria will take over most of what we're seeing on this map. And we'll spend some time looking at the Assyrians. To the south of the Assyrians, we have the city of Babylon. Now, in Genesis chapter 11, that's going to be called the city and the Tower of Babel. Babel and Babylon will be the same place. For some reason, the editors of our English Bible chose to name it Babylon in certain places and to name it Babel in Genesis chapter 11. I wish they hadn't done that. The land of the ziggurats, and of course, we're going to see those sort of temple towers all around Mesopotamia. A few other places, notice I lightened up in the middle, Aram. The country of Aram today is called Syria, but back in the ancient world, they referred to it as Aram. Perhaps you've heard that the Old Testament was written mostly in Hebrew, but there are a few chapters in both Daniel and also the book of Ezra that are written in a related language known as Aramaic. And Aramaic is the language of the people and country of Aram. Because it's so centrally located, the language of Aram, the Aramaic, is going to become sort of a common language in the ancient world in its day. We also have the Phoenicians to the north of Israel. Notice I've pointed along the coast because they are located right there on the coast of the Mediterranean, north of Israel. North of Israel, there's these great forests of cedar trees, the cedars of Lebanon, and they were great for building ships, so that the Phoenicians are going to be a sea power and the Israelites won't. The Israelites don't have any natural harbors in their area. They don't have those big cedars of Lebanon, so they're going to be mostly confined to the land. In fact, every time in the Bible we see a Jewish person or an Israelite getting onto a boat, that's always going to be bad news. We'll come to that in a future class. To the east of Assyria, we have the Medes, and we'll see them when we get to the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and maybe a little bit earlier than that. And then to the southeast of the Medes, we have the Persians. And of course, the land of the Persians is going to be extending far off our map, but it will include the area that we're looking at. Early in the biblical story, the Persians aren't going to be seen very much. They're out there keeping their sheep, but eventually they will rise, and we'll read about the Persian Empire. It will be the Medes and the Persians sort of together ruling at that time. Next, we want to focus in on the land of Canaan. This is where Israel is going to be. And so we're zooming in on this section and just seeing that notice how there's a slow curve, but there's no natural harbors along the coast. And if we were able to take this map and sort of turn it over and then cut it cross section, that's what we're looking at below, sort of a cross section where the land comes up from the Mediterranean, and as it comes out, it's on that straight coastal plain. It's not there's no cliffs along the ocean. It just comes right up out of the ocean, and you're right there along the coast. And as you move inland, you can actually stand on the coast, and you can see to the east what they call the Shephelah. Now, I didn't put that on the map here, but the Shephelah are the foothills. And then behind the foothills, you can see the central mountain range. And notice how there are mountains. They don't start very thick at first, but the further east you go, the higher they are. For example, if you get to Jerusalem, that's going to be about 2,500 feet above sea level. Um, but then if you continue to go east from there, you're going to go downhill all the way down to notice you've got the Dead Sea in the south and the Sea of Galilee in the north. And this is known as the Jordan Rift Valley because that valley, the Sea of Galilee, is actually 500 feet below sea level. And the Dead Sea today, it's actually gone down a bit, even in my lifetime, but today it's 1,400 feet below sea level. Back in the days of maybe Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, it was about 1,200 feet below sea level. Still, it's the lowest spot, both then and now, it's the lowest spot on the face of the earth, the Jordan Rift Valley. But then as you continue to go east, now before we continue to go east, let's look at this picture. This is an old photograph dating back to the 1960s, compliments of National Geographic, of the Jordan Rift Valley. And you can see the Jordan River sort of winding its way. It's very, very winding, and it's lush and fertile in that area. We're going to talk about why. The reason why is because in the rainy season, that whole valley just used to cover up with water. It doesn't do that anymore. They have dams to stop that. But back in that day, even in the 1960s, that whole area would flood, and it would leave a big layer of topsoil. And notice all the farms and crops that would be grown there. Now, that's not the case anymore. That's changed a bit, even in my lifetime. And then as you went south, as you followed the Jordan River south, all the way down to the Dead Sea, just before it hit the Dead Sea, it would straighten out. And notice the difference between that area way in the north that you can see both on the picture on the left, but also on the picture on the right. You see it at the top of the picture. And then as it straightens out, it also dries up and looks a bit like a desert because it's getting to the place so you can call it almost a water desert. The Dead Sea is the saltiest body of water, I think, in the world to this day. Maybe there's a few other places that have gotten even more salty. Um, Back when the first time I ever taught this class, it was about 5 times, the salt content was 5 times that of the ocean. Today, I think it's gone up to about 7 times. It's getting saltier as we speak because there's no outlet to that water. All right, so we had the Jordan Rift Valley. As we continue to the east, now we have what's called the Transjordanian Plateau. Jordan, because it's still connected to the Jordan River, that's actually now in the modern day country of Jordan. So there we have again our cross section, and we've come up to the Transjordanian Plateau, and you've sort of got an idea of the land masses that form the land of Canaan. But notice as you go to the north, the mountains actually move off right out into the ocean. You have that little lip that juts out into the ocean. And where it does that, just north of the mountains, there's a wide open valley, the Valley of Jezreel. And then to the north of that, the mountains start up again, and you're in the region of Galilee. The further north you go into what they call Lower Galilee, and then Upper Galilee means Lower Galilee is mountains, but they're not that high. And then they get higher in Upper Galilee, and until you've left the land of Canaan, and you've entered the land to the north. We're not going to go there for this class right now. Here's a picture of that Valley of Jezreel. I'm standing on the ruins of an ancient city of Megiddo. Sometimes people refer to that valley after the name of the city. They call it Har Megiddo, it means Mount Megiddo, or we say sometimes Armageddon. But this wide open valley is the most fertile area in the entire country of Canaan. And see that those houses, those buildings on the other side of the valley, that's the modern day city of Nazareth. Now, back in the Old Testament times, if that was even a village, it was so small that nobody even noticed it. Very, very tiny, but it's grown largely because of its fame due to Jesus having grown up there. Let's come back to our map. Notice to the east of the Jordan River, I have the land of Gilead, and I'll see cities there like Jabesh Gilead and Ramoth Gilead. As soon as you say Gilead, you know that's to the east of the Jordan River. And so that's going to become part of, well, it was part of Canaan, but it's going to become part of Israel as well. Now I'm going to look at some of the rivers that flow into the Jordan. One of those is the Jabbok River. The word Jabbok actually means to wrestle. And we're going to read in Genesis chapter 32 how Jacob is going to find himself alone with a man and he's going to wrestle. We find out later it's an angel. And I think that might be where the river Jabbok gets its name, although there's a similar word that just means to descend, to flow down or something, to empty, I guess. And it might be that, but I tend to give the name to Jacob. I think he's the one that gave it its name. And then you move south of that down to the Dead Sea. Notice how there's, the Jordan, of course, flows into the Dead Sea from the north. But then there's another river as you move south, and that's known as the Arnon River. And that river also flows into the Dead Sea. And where it flows, it has cut a very deep channel. Let's look at a picture. That's going to be the northern border of Moab. Let's look at a picture of the Arnon River. That's going to be a barrier. Sometimes some people have called it the Grand Canyon of the Middle East, and I guess you could call it that. Now, Grand Canyon is a whole lot bigger, but still, it's a good-sized canyon. And if you're going north and south, you're not going to cross the Arnon there. You're gonna go far inland, far to the east, to go around that canyon. That's quite a barrier, which is why it forms the northern border of the land of Moab. There are several major roads that run through and by the land of Canaan. The first of those is the King's Highway, and it runs from Damascus in the north. Damascus is off our map to the north, all the way down. Notice it passes to the east of the Arnon River and also to the east of a good portion of the Jabbok, about, I'd say, maybe 20, 25 miles to the east. And it goes south all the way down to the Red Sea. That was one of the major trade routes. Someplace south of Damascus, but north of the Sea of Galilee, there's a second road that branches off, and this is known as the Way of the Sea, or it's called in the Bible the Way of the Philistines. And it passes, remember how we looked at that picture of Megiddo? We were standing there looking across the valley. Well, it passes by Megiddo, and there's a pass in the mountains, and Megiddo guards the pass. So Megiddo became sort of an important city in that part of the world to guard the major trade route going south through the Way of the Philistines. Philistines are They're going to live on the area to the south of Canaan, right along the ocean, as that road makes its way to Egypt. Just north of the Dead Sea, there was a third road, not as important because this was a seasonal road, and it's going to go east to west, the Jericho Road, and it will be near Jericho. Jericho is going to guard the road, but notice it passes over the Jordan River, and I see it seasonal because at certain times of the year, the Jordan is not passable. They didn't have bridges. Bridges really hadn't been invented quite yet. At least good-sized bridges, sturdy bridges. Now, maybe a log over a river, you could do something like that. But bridge building was not really a thing that I can tell. And so the Jericho Road would pass that way through a pass in the mountains and down to the other side, sort of a shortcut. And it's going to be significant, but not as significant as the King's Highway and the Way of the Sea. We want to look at the climate of Canaan. Canaan is a Mediterranean climate. The idea behind that, we usually say it doesn't get too hot, it doesn't get too cold. Actually, I've been in Galilee when it was 110 degrees, but they were setting all sorts of records that year, so it's not usually that hot. And yes, it can snow, but it's not really a heavy snow, so it doesn't get too cold either. But what we do have is Canaan is heavily dependent upon their winter rains. You see, around October, it will start to rain a little bit more in November, a little bit more in December, and by January is the height of their rainy season. Starts to taper off in February and March, maybe a little bit in April. By May, it is completely dry. So that's what we call the early and the later rains. Early rains start in October, later rains stop around April, and that doesn't mean it doesn't rain in the middle. It does. But then by May, by the summer months, May, June, July, August, September, it doesn't rain at all, except maybe a little bit of sprinkle right on the coast. But inland, there's almost no rain at all. So if it doesn't rain in the winter, everything dries up. Now you can go down to Egypt and it doesn't rain almost at all in Egypt. Again, maybe a little bit on the coast, but throughout most of Egypt, it doesn't rain. But that's okay because it rains many thousands of miles to the south, and the waters of the Nile bring the water up, so they always have water. Not so in Israel. If it doesn't rain in the winter, it's not going to rain in the summer, and everything starts to die. They are really dependent upon those winter rains. I want to also talk just a bit about Western thinking versus Eastern thinking. Now, we in the West, and I live in the United States of America, solidly westernized in my thinking. For example, my country is a country of individuals. I sometimes call them a nation of rebels, where we actually have what we call Independence Day, the rebellious day, the day where we celebrate our freedom and they celebrate our rebellion and we celebrate our individualism. In the East, they are much more concerned, both then and even today to a certain degree, with the collective rather than the individual. It's not about me, it's about us. Think how often in the New Testament you read about how not that Christ died for me, but that Christ died for us. Now, if he died for us, he died for me too. That's the way we would normally picture it. But the focus is on the collective in the East. Secondly, the difference between right and wrong versus honor and shame. In the West, we are all concerned about right and wrong. You did that, you didn't do that. In the East, they have those categories. It's not that right and wrong disappear, but much more important, because of that collective society, much more important are the qualities of honor and shame. Now, think about Genesis chapter 3, when Adam and Eve eat of the tree of the garden. And we look at that and we say, oh my, they sinned, they did wrong. And let me just say, they did. That's true. But that's not how the passage is going to describe it. It will describe about how their eyes are opened and they become aware of their nakedness and they try to hide. This is a picture of honor and shame. They are ashamed of what they've done. And so it's all about these qualities of honor and shame. Another place you see this is in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. It talks about the death of Christ, how he went to the cross. What does it say? Despising the shame. We tend to read right over that and not even notice it. But they would have picked that up in the Eastern world. Honor and shame were important categories. Next, here in the West, we are very concerned with time. We are time oriented. As I'm sitting here in my office right now, there's a clock on the wall. I can tell you what time it is. My classes start on time, and I always guarantee they're going to end before it's too late. I never get my students over. I'm very time oriented. In the East, that's not the case at all. It's all about timeliness, and we're thinking about times and seasons, and that's not at 1 o'clock sharp. That's sometime in that day or those days and the season and so on. It's more about timeliness, about propriety in certain seasons. Time oriented versus timeliness. Very, very different. So that, for example, somebody might ask the question, why is there a prophecy about how Jesus would be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights, and yet the Gospels say that he arose on the third day? Which is it, 3 days and 3 nights or the third day? And we in the West struggle with that. In the East, they would have looked at us saying, "What's wrong with you? It's not about the exact time. It's about timeliness. It's about the season." And they wouldn't be so concerned. That wouldn't even be a question. It is to us because we're Western thinkers. In the West, we have rules. In the East, yeah, I'm not saying all rules disappear, but the emphasis is more on relationship. So that when we read, for example, the Ten Commandments, yes, they will be rules, but more importantly, they will be covenant stipulations. They will be the key to understanding how the relationship between God and man is supposed to work. And seeing that is going to make a big difference as well. Let me close with two questions. First of all, what is the big idea of the Old Testament? Sometimes people will say, well, Jesus is the big idea. And of course, he is prophesied. I don't want to minimize that. But he's not always seen clearly, at least not to my eyes necessarily. I think he is there throughout the entire Old Testament. But I think there's a bigger idea that is more front and center. What could that be? The promise versus fulfillment, certainly that's there as well. But I don't see promises on every page. What I do see, and here I'm going to borrow from my Jewish friends. If I ask a Jewish person, what's the big idea of the Hebrew Scriptures of the Old Testament? He's probably going to answer with what they will call the Shema. It means hear, and it's taken from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, that starts off, "Hear, O Israel, Shema Israel." And it goes on to say that Yahweh is Lord, Yahweh alone. That God, he is Lord. Now, that brings up the next question. What is the big idea of the New Testament? And I don't have to look very far, because 5 or 6 different times we read, quote unquote, that Jesus is Lord. Now think about this. If the big idea in the Old Testament is that Yahweh is Lord, and the big idea in the New Testament is that Jesus is Lord, that tells me something about Jesus that we will gradually see in our journey through the Hebrew Scriptures.